Hello everyone! Thank you for your patience if you've been waiting for this video for the last couple weeks. I've been trying to get it done, and I meant to get it done sooner, but these videos, these Jane Eyre scene adaptation comparison videos, are proving to be more time-consuming and more challenging than I expected. Last time, which was also the first time, we talked about the horse scene, and it seems the logical thing to do the second video on the scene that follows that, a scene which I most often see referred to as the first conversation scene. This is Jane's first official interview with her new employer, Mr. Rochester, which takes place in Chapter 13. It occurs at tea time the day after Rochester has arrived, since the night he came, he went straight to bed with his injured ankle, and then spent the better part of the following day attending to business. Many of the adaptations, though, choose to place this conversation immediately after Jane returns from her walk. I suppose there's more dramatic effect in having the one scene lead right into the next. When I first started the Jane Eyre project 3 years ago now, I joked about using a spreadsheet or a checklist or a rubric to keep track of which adaptations had what. I ended up not doing that. It didn't seem to be necessary when I was taking notes and reviewing each adaptation on its own, but I've decided to try doing it now. The content of the first conversation I broke up into 9 major components. Jane getting an official summons and or having to change her gown, Mrs. Fairfax's chatter or confusion during the conversation, talk of presents or cadeau, Rochester's rapid-fire interrogation about Jane's origins, talk of men in green or mythical allusions similar to that line, talk of Brocklehurst, the question of how well she can play the piano, examination of her sketches, and Rochester's abrupt dismissal. I should clarify, in case anyone's wondering, that this is not the conversation where Rochester asks if she finds him handsome. That is the second conversation, which will be the next video. In this first conversation, Rochester generally acts testy, impatient, a little rude. Jane, on the other hand, remains unruffled by his rudeness and answers his barrage of questions calmly and quietly, refusing to be intimidated by his lack of manners, and now and then showing her own independence of thought. Both of them are very direct, and unlike poor Mrs. Fairfax, do without the social niceties. There's a small taste of verbal swordplay, and I personally always find the business with the piano humorous. Nonetheless, this is a professional interview. Only once or twice does it stray from the strictly business path, and it's on those occasions that there's a hint of a spark between them. Otherwise, this isn't a scene that gives the impression of two people falling in love. Unfortunately, that is the exact route that the 1934 version took. Rochester, whose ankle has made a miraculous recovery, is gentlemanly, apologetic, polite, completely besotted. In other words, his manners are all wrong, and he's completely unlike how Rochester should be. He asks her to play the piano, and she obliges, and he makes googly eyes at her while she sings Schubert's Serenade for him. It's nice and all, yes, but it couldn't be further from how it's supposed to be. The 1944 version goes more along the lines of what you'd expect. One big difference, and my least favorite thing about this particular scene, is that when Jane walks in, Rochester snaps his fingers at her and directs her to pour more hot water into the bucket he's soaking his foot in. I'm not a fan of this at all, though Jane doesn't seem to find it as insulting as I would. But at least when Wells's Rochester barks at her or says something abrasive, it doesn't seem to be personal. He's just rude to everyone, especially the members of his household, and it's not that he's being rude to her. That's a small concession, I know. He's still rude, but without Jane showing any displeasure, he does immediately realize on his own that he's been demanding and apologizes. Well, he sort of apologizes. Now, the 1970 version, setting aside the age adjustment in the main characters, is not bad. For the most part, Scott plays Rochester as very tired in this scene, exhausted from his journey and his injury, and world-weary besides. Susanna York's Jane is more tense than she was in the book. This is one of the versions in which the conversation immediately follows Jane's return, and she's still recovering from the shock and chagrin of finding out that her employer is the injured man from the lane. This version hits most of the major points. There are no sketches, but some of the dialogue from that section is incorporated. And I do like that Jane plays the movie's love theme on the piano, just because I like that music. The 1973 version, of course, is the most faithful one, meticulously checking all the boxes. One thing I especially enjoy about this one is actually Mrs. Fairfax's shocked reaction when Rochester brings up his previous run-in with Jane, and I think she's a little scandalized when they talk of the men in green. The way this scene plays out shows Jane to be a surprisingly easy conversationalist when Rochester asks her more broad, introspective questions. And again, Saoirse Cusack is very good-natured throughout. The only time she really frowns is when Brocklehurst comes up. Rochester, on the other hand, is especially bad-tempered in this one. Jason lays it on thick, being extremely irritated whenever Adele approaches him, and very short with Mrs. Fairfax. Yet you can see him getting more and more interested with Jane's quick responses and unconventional answers, leading to his desire to have further conversation with her later. My only criticism of this one is that it's a little long. There's more time spent on every facet of the conversation, including Jane's sketches. Doesn't that woman that Jane painted look a little like Bertha? But it seems so unfair for me to complain about the length when it's only so long because it's taken the time to play out everything from the book, which is one of this version's greatest strengths. The 1983 version also manages to squeeze in all 9 of the major elements, and I think in a little less time than 73. Jane seems a little, not stiff, but kind of prim. She and Rochester did speak less in their version of the horse scene, so perhaps that's a factor in how she behaves toward him here. I really like how quickly and coolly Jane responds to his line about the men in green. If you think about it, it's really an odd thing to say, and so out of the blue, yet she barely blinks before answering him in kind. Rochester doesn't react much to this beyond a little pause, but he clearly appreciates her answer, for where he was abrupt with her before, it's after this that I feel his manner becomes less hostile, and he starts talking to her less like a new governess and more like an individual. I like Dalton's delivery of the sketches dialogue as well. It's not the easiest dialogue to deliver naturally, but he does it. And I chuckle at the look of alarm that Jane shoots at Adele when he says Adele showed him Jane's sketches, as if Jane never intended him to see her amateur artwork. Rochester's treatment of Adele in this first conversation scene was not something I was on the watch for when I first started out, especially since she's not always present in the scene. But it was around this point that I started to take note of it. While Jason pushes her away, Dalton is tolerant of her, but keeps her at a distance, which I like better, and which I think is closer to what the book portrays. What I noticed first about the 1996 version was how happy Adele is. Rochester doesn't say or do much of anything with her, but she's just excited that he's home. This version touches on most of the basics, the only major omissions being the piano and the sketches, but it doesn't flesh them out, so it's like an abridged edition of the scene, therefore it is a very quick first conversation. However, the conversation does continue in a following scene set on a different day, and that is where they talk about the sketches. It's a much more relaxed, informal, even amicable conversation in which Jane actually smiles. I often think of Charlotte Gainsbourg as the most solemn Jane, so this was nice to see. The 1997 version is another one that places this first interview immediately after Jane's return. As the dialogue unfolds, it becomes clear that the script only follows the bare bones of the original dialogue and goes off on its own every couple of lines. Some of these changes I don't like. Jane is still indignant with Rochester, putting on airs that a well-trained governess shouldn't exhibit, and accusing him of deceiving her. Ooh, foreshadowing. Also, her continued grudge against him is confusing because in the hall, just seconds before, we saw her smile when she put two and two together and realized he was the man in the lane. This seems inconsistent. But some of the changes I think are interesting. Rochester is much more good-humored here than in the other interpretations. Shocking, since Hines is considered the angry, brash Rochester, and while his manners aren't polished, he's by no means the rudest Rochester in this scene. The other big change is that he's much more affectionate with Adele. She comes running in and sits on his lap, and he cuddles her and quietly asks her questions about Miss Eyre. It's a sweet moment, and shows a side of Rochester that we hardly ever see, and from the perspective of someone who's just watching a movie, I like it. Unfortunately, it's far from book accurate, even if it does give you a warm, fuzzy feeling. In the 2006 version, we see Jane anxiously fussing with her clothing and building herself up to the task of officially meeting Rochester. I'm not sure if she proves equal to it. Rochester is especially moody and sarcastic here. Gone is the hint of fun we saw from him in the horse scene. Perhaps the change in his behavior is caused by the change in setting. Here he's back in the confines of Thornfield, acting in the official role of master, doing his duty and interviewing the new governess, who last night was just a strange young woman he encountered in Hay Lane, who showed him a surprising amount of spirit, something that is lacking here, where Jane is compelled to act demure and reserved as befits her station. They are both restricted in their words in a way they weren't when they were total strangers meeting in bizarre circumstances in the wild outdoors. Again, he's very sarcastic, especially about Adele, not harsh, but still pushing her away, and his dismissal of Jane seems to be brought on by the painful sight of Adele flouncing around with her cadeau, which reminds him of her mother and his past mistakes. The 2011 version starts with an amusing exchange between Jane and Mrs. Fairfax, with Jane bewildered at the idea of having to change her clothes for Rochester when all her dresses are the same. Rochester's got her sketchbook open on his lap when she enters, which is different from some other versions where the opening of the sketchbook seems like Rochester's way of changing the subject. This version goes in a different direction with the dialogue, when Rochester cynically asks Jane about her tale of woe. Jane insists that she hasn't one, and provides a brief history of her life, which of course is miserable, and Rochester contradicts her previous denial. There are a lot of embellishments to this dialogue, taking the bare bones from the book and adding a little to them here and there. The absence of the cadeau and the piano is surprising, but they get props for including the men in green line, especially how they play it. Jane is very smooth and honest, showing no surprise at all and responding without hesitation, which of course he notices. And I even feel like in this version, Rochester purposely throws that comment out there to try and confuse her, but instead, she gives it right back. Now would be the time when I say which one is my favorite, but I find I don't have one. The versions of the scene that include some variation of the men in green line do rank a little higher with me. I enjoy that part of the conversation and it's become a highlight, and it's a little more obscure. And I also enjoy the versions where Jane tinkers a little at the piano and then Rochester roars, "Enough! Clearly you do play a little," and I feel like the less she plays, the better, the funnier it is. If you have a favorite version of this scene, I'd love to know what it is, and I do hope you're enjoying these videos. There have only been 2 so far, but there will be more, and I'm still trying to figure out how exactly I want to do it, and so I thank you for bearing with me. You have been very patient and encouraging, and I really appreciate that. I know the first conversation isn't as big or as popular a moment as some others, but I do hope you'll let me know what you think of this scene and the various interpretations of it. I look forward to hearing your thoughts as always, and as always, thanks for watching.